On a reasonably even-temperatured Sunday in February, two forces of nature meet to take on one of the biggest battles known inside these four walls. Few understand the heart of the game. This is a game of strategy, and the slightest slip-up could cost you everything. The stakes have never been higher. Tears have been shed, blood spilled. This effort has been poured over in sweat. Every time these two collide, you can feel the intensity, the ice-cold blood that runs through their veins. The battle is real, and the struggle is far from over. But there can only be one winner. The heat of the game will soon be over, the battle soon forgotten, and for these two, the winner may never be clear. But there will always be another Sunday.
So here's the thing, you know we could not make it through a marriage series without talking about conflict at some point. And the small things, sometimes the big things that tend to bring up tension in our relationships and in our marriages. Now, funny thing is actually in preparing for this weekend, I went to Jenny and I was like, Jenny, what are the small conflicts that we tend to have in our marriage? What are the small things we tend to argue about and, that bring up tension in our marriage? And I promise you when I say this, we racked our brains and we could not think of any. And the reason why is because every example we thought of was huge and massive and big. And maybe some of you can relate to that. So we got to talk about conflict. Now, let me, as we start the conversation, let me just kind of point this out real quick. And we've been saying this over the last couple of weeks, just trying to give some context to things. Listen, when we talk about conflict, we talk about fighting, we talk about arguing, all that. We're not talking today about, abuse in a relationship. So if you're here, we're not talking about abusive relationships, whether that's physical abuse or mental, emotional, sexual abuse. We're not talking about any of that. We're talking about, when we talk about conflict in a marriage and in a relationship today, we're talking about, the countless small things that tend to bring tension up, right? The things that we all face, like 99.9% of us all face in our marriages and our relationships. And let me just start the conversation by talking about sort of the source of conflict, where conflict comes from. And we've talked about this before, so this is probably a review for some of you. But the reality is, in every single one of our relationships, we all bring in expectations, right? We all have a set of expectations that we bring into our marriages, that we bring into our relationships. And then, every now and then, there's a gap between our expectations and the experience that we're having in that particular relationship. Right? There's a gap. Now, sometimes this is real small. It's real kind of simple stuff. You expect the toilet seat to get pushed down. The experience doesn't happen. You expect them to be home by 5:30. They get home at 6:15 and they never even call, right? Kind of simple stuff, right? Sometimes you expect the way they're going to parent. You have a certain set of expectations about the way your spouse will parent, and yet the experience is they don't parent like that. You expect to have a certain amount of nights at home together as a family. Experiences, that doesn't happen. What about money? You expect to handle money with a certain set of values and a certain way that you handle money, and the experience is your spouse doesn't have the same set of values. And with the money thing, by the way, real quick, I'm just kind of camp on this one for a second. 32% of couples say that the number one topic they wish they would have talked about more before getting into marriage is money. And that's why, by the way, any couple here at our church that wants to get married, we have incredible premarital mentors here at all of our locations. And any couple that wants to get married, we make them go through, a process before they get married to talk about these topics. And money is one of the major topics because money tends to bring this up right here, this gap between experience and expectations. And sometimes I know also that gap is wide and it is deep and it is cavernous. There's addiction in the home. And there's a gap between expectations and experience. And there's neglect in the home. And there's a gap between expectations and experience. But no matter kind of what it is for you, no matter what it looks like, we all have experienced that gap right there. And here's the thing. When that gap between expectations and experience happens, what happens in the middle of it is conflict. That's where conflict erupts, is when there's a gap, no matter how wide that gap is. And we hate that. Every single person. It doesn't matter if you're a type A, driven kind of personality. We all hate conflict, particularly when it comes to a relationship that we have to keep kind of navigating. We hate having to always keep going back to this gap and having to navigate conflict. None of us want that. In fact, we hate conflict so much that we will do anything and everything to try to get rid of conflict. And we address this and we handle this in sometimes really negative ways. Some of us, because we hate conflict so much, we try to coerce our spouse. We try to coerce the other person that they need to change. And so we manipulate and we shame and we condemn and we threaten. Really all because we don't want to deal with this. And so we find ourselves saying, look, I know you have expectations of me. I know the expectations you have of me, but I'm not changing. You need to change your expectations. You need to adapt your expectations because I am who I am, and that's not changing. And we try to coerce them and twist their arm because we don't want to deal with that. And then on the other side of that, some of us, we're not coercers, we're conformers. And it's really just another way, it's kind of the opposite side of the coin of trying to get rid of that. And so we find ourselves in the middle of conflict saying things like, fine, whatever. Fine, whatever. And you don't mean fine, whatever. And you don't really believe fine, whatever. You just don't want to deal with that. And so it's easy to say, you know what, fine, whatever. I'll conform. It's not what I want to do, but I'll change my expectations. It's not what I do, but I'll change what I'm doing because I don't really want to deal with that. And so the conflict goes away when you conform, but it's not because anything's been resolved. It's just because you let the other person win. And even though you let them win, you still feel the things you do. You still feel neglected. You still feel disrespected. You still feel unheard. So it's all still there. And you know what's interesting about conforming? What's interesting about conforming is that it takes a ton of energy to address conflict, but did you know it takes just as much energy to avoid it? It takes just as much energy to stuff our feelings down and to not address the conflict that exists in our marriages and our relationships. In fact, some of us, we grew up in homes and you saw this. You saw this in your homes. You saw this with your parents, that they had a marriage where there was not a lot of conflict, but there also was no life. They were just kind of like roommates. They just kind of did life together. And so it looked like there was peace, but it's just because they were stuffing all of the things that they should have been talking about. They're just stuffing down, and that takes energy, and it takes so much energy that by the end of the day, they don't even talk. Because they've been spending so much time stuffing down the things that they've been feeling. In fact, psychologists have a word for this. They call those kinds of marriages devitalized marriages. In other words, the vitality is gone. The life is gone. There's not a lot of conflict, true, but there's no life because they refuse to deal with it. These are the ways we end up, and here's why we don't want conflict. You know why we don't want conflict? You know why we coerce and why we conform? You know why we do whatever we need to do to get rid of that? It's because we have believed a lie about this. We've all, it doesn't matter who you are, you've believed this lie at some point. I've believed this lie. We have all believed this lie. There is a myth out there about conflict. You know what it is? It's this. My marriage would be so much better if that wasn't there. And that's the lie. My marriage, our marriage would be so much better if that was gone. And that's not true. That's a myth. In fact, this is so important. Man, you got to hear this. So important. The fact that conflict exists in your marriage is not the sign that you have a bad marriage. The fact that conflict exists in your marriage, that is not the sign that your marriage is on the rocks. You know what the fact that conflict exists in your marriage, you know what that's a sign of? That's a sign that there are two human beings in the marriage. Because anytime you have two people who bring in their own expectations, you will always have at some point a gap between expectations and experience. It means you're normal when there's conflict. It doesn't mean that the marriage is bad. In fact, conflict may actually be a sign that you care about the relationship. I love how Les and Leslie Parrott talk about this. They wrote the book, Saving Your Marriage Before It Starts. It's a book, resource that we've been leaning on heavily throughout this series. And I love the way they talk about this. This is what they say. Conflict is the price we pay for deepening intimacy. Conflict is the price we pay for deepening intimacy. This is why no one can aggravate you quite like your spouse. This is why no one can get under your skin quite like your spouse. Why? Because you're close to them. You're intimate with them. They know you. You know them. And conflict is the price we pay for deepening intimacy. And I love this because in some ways this is such a reorientation of how we view conflict, how we view arguing, how we view fighting. Because fighting might actually, when there's fighting going on in a relationship, that might mean that there's something there worth fighting for. In fact, when couples come to our church all the time looking for guidance in their marriage, and anytime a couple comes to me and they say, man, Jace, we just need to talk about our marriage, we are fighting all the time in our marriage. Do you know my first sort of gut level reaction to them is always, that's good news. That's actually really good news that you're fighting on. You know why? Because that means you still believe in each other enough to fight. You still believe something. You still believe this marriage could be something, and so you're fighting about it. So we can work with that. That's a great starting point. See, we tend to think, for any of us who face conflict and who face conflict in our marriage, we tend to think that the issues in our marriage, the deepest issues in our marriage exist because of the conflict. But that's not true. The deepest issues in our marriage exist because of the way we handle the conflict. It's not because of the conflict. It's because of how we deal with the conflict. And research has shown this and proven this time and time again, that this is the case. In fact, research over and over again suggests with marriages and relationships that the strongest indicators that whether or not your marriage will last is not how many disagreements you have. It's not whether there's conflict, but rather the strongest indicators of whether or not your marriage will last and survive is how you handle those disagreements. Which is why knowing how to fight fair is absolutely critical to the survival of your marriage. You don't have to be a coercer. You don't have to be a conformer. You don't have to get in the middle of conflict and sit there and try to say, you know what, you've got to change. You don't have to say, you know what, I'm just going to conform. You don't have to live that way, guys. There is a much better way of handling conflict. And it starts with fighting fair. And the better way of fighting fair comes down to this one kind of simple idea that couples who thrive know. Couples who fight fair, you know what they do? They fight for resolution, not victory. That's the key. Couples who fight fair fight for resolution. They don't fight for victory. And there's a fundamental difference between the two, because couples who fight fair know that when one person wins in the middle of conflict, when one person wins in an argument, the couple loses. When one person wins, the relationship loses. And when we go into conflict and we frame it sort of like, I'm going to win this argument, I'm going to win this, and we go in it looking at it as something to be won and victory is to be had, all of a sudden your spouse is not your spouse anymore, they're your opponent. They're your adversary. They're the person you're trying to win over. They're the person you're trying to conquer. You can't have a relationship like that. But couples who fight fair, no, that's not the point. We fight for resolution, not victory. And when we talk about here fighting for resolution, resolution is not compromise. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about compromise. Compromise is, okay, you got a night out with the girls, I get a night out with the boys. All right, good, we're even now, right? And that's needed in every relationship. Compromise is a necessary thing for every relationship that's healthy. But that's not what we're talking about when we talk about resolution. When we talk about resolution, resolution is about understanding. Resolution is about seeking understanding of your spouse. And what couples who thrive, even in the middle of conflict, know, couples who fight fair, what they know is that conflict actually creates the opportunity to more deeply understand your spouse. The conflict sets the stage that this is a moment we can know each other a little bit more. We can more deeply connect with each other. And here's the good news, guys. Here's the good news. The good news is this, is that fighting fair in the middle of conflict, fighting for resolution, it really comes down to two simple choices that you're going to have to make when there's conflict. Two really simple choices. Challenging, but simple. And here's the really, really good news. The even better news is we don't have to guess at what those choices are because the Bible puts them out there really clearly and says, you make these two choices, you're going to learn to fight fair. You're going to learn to fight for resolution even when there's conflict. And so I just want to look at one small passage with you from the New Testament. It was from a guy named James who was writing a letter to people who were interested in learning how to fight fair, to people who were interested in saying, man, how do you navigate conflict in a way that honors the other person, that works for resolution and honors God at the same time? And this is what James says. This is in James 1, chapter 1, 19 and 20. So it says, understand this, my dear brothers and sisters. In other words, if you're in the middle of conflict, listen up, lean in. You got to hear this. You must all be quick to listen and what? Slow to speak. That is really obnoxious, but I'm just going to do that every time I say that. No, I'm not. But slow to speak and slow to get angry. So quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to get angry. For human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Now that's simple. And James kind of breaks this thing down into two sort of ways. He says, be quick to listen, slow to speak. You do that, you'll be slow to get angry. But you got to start by being quick to listen. You got to be slow to speak. So I just want to talk about these two things real quick. What would it look like in the middle of conflict to be quick to listen and slow to speak? So let's talk about this first one. Let's talk about quick to listen real quick. That was funny. I didn't mean to say it like that. Let's talk about quick to listen real quick. So here's the thing. Most of us, when we get into conflict, most of us, when we get into an argument, what is the very first reaction we tend to have when there's conflict? Is it to listen or is it to talk? Now, for most of us, it's to vent. It's to already like start spewing out words like, how could you? What did you do? What did you even think about this? And all of a sudden, like we just talk first. And James says, hold up. You want to fight for resolution, not just fight for victory? You're going to have to be quick to listen. You're going to have to slow down for a second, and you're going to have to be quick to listen. Not quick to make your case, not quick to lay out your arguments, but quick to listen. I love how Proverbs 29:11 says this. It says, fools vent their anger. Like anyone can do that. Any fool can do that. Just you erupt, right? Like a volcano, you just vent your anger. Fools vent their anger, but the wise quietly hold it back. Why? So you can listen and gain understanding. James says, you want to start with fighting for resolution, not just victory, man. It starts with being quick to listen. I mean, think about this, guys. How different would our conflicts, our arguments, and things that we fight over, how different would those conflicts be if we started out those conversations by saying this really simple phrase, help me understand where you're coming from? Because I just want to listen right now. Help me understand where you're coming from. I mean, how different would the tone of that conversation be? Help me understand. In fact, let's just practice that. That is so simple. Help me understand. Let's just practice. I'm going to ask you to say, help me understand on the count of three. All of our locations right now. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Help me understand. See, you didn't die, right, when you said that. Some of you men, that's the first time you've ever said those words, right? Help me understand. Because you're coming at it from a posture saying, I want to listen. I want to listen. I want to be quick to listen. And when we are quick to listen, and we say, help me understand, two things are going to happen. Two things are going to happen in the middle of conflict. The first thing that's going to happen when you're quick to listen, you say, man, just help me understand where you're coming from on this, is one, you're going to find common ground with your spouse and the person you're in a relationship with. Even though you're arguing, even though there's conflict, there is always common ground. There is always something that you are tied together. There's always something that you both want. And the only way you can discover that is by listening. And you may have to dig deep, and you may have to listen really hard, but there's something there that you both want. It's birthday season in my home. And so a couple weeks ago, my son Silas turned 9. A couple weeks from now, my daughter Sienna turns 12. And, by the way, I haven't shared this with a lot of you, but we've got another one on the way. So there's that. Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, I did well. Good, thank you. By the way, we haven't decided on a name yet, and so because our other two children's name starts with S's, I think we've decided we're going to name this one Surprise, because that's what it was. So, what are we talking about? So it's birthday season in our home, and so Jenny a couple of weeks ago, we're talking about our birthday parties we're going to be doing for Silas and Sienna. And Jenny values birthdays. Like, man, I mean, like, birthdays are a real big deal to Jenny. And so she's going through and she's telling me these plans she's got for these birthdays. I mean, these plans would rival the Super Bowl halftime show. And as she's listing these things, you know, or some of you know at least, there's only one sound going through my brain. Thank you. Cha-ching, 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 cha-ching. So I decided I needed to let Jenny know that. Yeah. Expectations and experience gap. And all of a sudden there's conflict. And you can feel the temperature of that conversation rising a little bit. It wasn't a lot at first, but then it got a little bit hotter, and then it got a little bit hotter, and then it got a little bit hotter. And here's the thing. We've been doing this long enough now, and we've learned a few tricks along the way. And we've learned this kind of like, okay, help me understand. I know there's common ground there. And so at one point in the conversation, and it changed the tone of the entire conversation because conflict was there, we just stopped. And we just said, you know what? Let's just back up for a second. You know what we both want? Here's what we both want. We both want our kids to feel incredibly valued. We want them to have such an incredible experience for their birthdays that they know that there is nothing more important in this world to us than them. We want them to feel valued. We want them to feel special. We want them to feel worthy of incredible birth. Can we just start there? Yes. All right. We're on the same page there. Now, we may have different ways of getting there. Let's talk about that. We can talk about that, but at least now we're facing in the same direction. At least now we're tracking with each other. So does this make sense what I'm saying? Like when you listen, you can find, let's just back up for a second before we get too deep into this. Help me understand where you're coming from. Okay, I want the same thing you want. We have two different ways to get it there. Let's talk. Let's at least start there though. And you find common ground because you stop and you're quick to listen. And listening is the only way to discover what you both truly want, which creates the context for a deeper conversation. The second thing, though, being quick to listen does, not only do you find common ground, but you actually, if you're quick to listen, you begin to hear and find the issue behind the issue. Because the issue that's bringing up the conflict is really rarely about the issue that needs to be talked about. And sometimes when we talk about being quick to listen, it's not just being quick to listen to your spouse or to the person you're in a relationship with, but sometimes we need to get quiet and be quick to listen to ourselves. In other words, what am I feeling right now? What am I feeling right now because of this conflict? What feelings is this conflict and this argument? What is this dredging up? And sometimes we're so quick to talk that we never have to process and we never have to think, what is it that I'm actually feeling that I need to kind of bring to the table? Because you know this, arguments are rarely about the things we're arguing about. There's usually much deeper feelings that are involved other than the surface issues that we're arguing about. You know, arguments about money tend to bring up feelings of being controlled. And arguments about kids tend to bring up feelings of inadequacy and insecurity. Like, I don't know how to do this. And arguments about sex tend to bring up feelings of rejection. And arguments about work tend to bring up feelings of being disrespected. And if you can just get quiet and not jump in, but you can be quick to listen to yourself as well, like what's going on, you can identify what those feelings are, what is dredging up. And man, that's where the gold is. That's where relationships are forged. It's when you begin to say, man, this is what I'm feeling right now, and I need to just talk to you about it. But you can only experience that when you get quiet and you listen. Man, what is it I'm processing right now? Do you want to fight fair? Do you want to fight fair in your relationships, in your marriage? Do you want to fight for resolution, not just victory? It starts with being quick to listen. Saying, help me understand. And listen to things that are going on inside of you so you can talk about those. But it doesn't end there. Remember, James didn't just say be quick to listen. He also said be slow to speak. Be slow to speak. And I love this idea here that James brings up because it's almost like this idea of slowing down your reaction. When all of a sudden, it's amped up, you're amped up, and you want to just react, James says, slow down. Slow down your reaction. Because guys, listen, come on, you know this. There are 1 million small offenses that your spouse throws your way in the course of a week. And some of those things just need to be let go. And when we don't slow down and choose, like, is this something I should really react to? Is this something, when we don't, we just react to everything. But there are a million things that just need to be let go. And if you want to know, like, Jason, how do I even know? How do I know if something that they're doing or something they said, how do I know whether that should go in the let go bucket or if that should go in the I should address it bucket? Well, here's one little easy tool. Just wait 24 hours. And if you still feel the way you do about that, whatever they said or did 24 hours later, then yeah, address it. But if you don't feel that way after 24 hours, then let it go. Slow down. So part of what James is saying is also when you do need to address it, though, when you said, no, 24 hours later, it's still there, I do need to address it, well, it matters how we communicate in that moment. It matters how we address it. So he says, slow to speak. I love how this proverb says it. Reckless words pierce like a sword. In Proverbs 12:18. And how many of us know that to be true? Come on. How many of us have been on the receiving end of that? And we've used words like, oh, it just pierced. Guys, listen, you cannot fight for resolution. You can't. You cannot fight for resolution in your marriage and use reckless words. Can't do it. Those two things don't go together. John Gottman is a psychologist, and him and his team have, over the years, they have studied literally thousands and thousands and thousands of couples, particularly couples who are in conflict and experiencing conflict. And they have, because they've studied so many couples, they have now, they say that within over 90% accuracy, they can determine whether or not a couple and their marriage is going to survive based on how they deal and handle conflict. And because of that, they've actually said there's a few key indicators that if these things are present in the middle of conflict, it's not a good picture. It's not heading down a good road. And they all have to do with the way we communicate to the other and what we communicate to our spouse. One of the things they talk about is criticism. You know, there's a fine line, but there's a monumental difference between complaining and criticizing. And some complaints in a marriage are legit. They're legit. You know what I mean? Like, but complaints always, they tend to start with the word I. So a complaint would be, you know what? I feel so much more pressure. I feel stressed out. I feel anxiety when you don't tell me your schedule for the week and you just kind of are in and out and I never know what you're going to do and I can't feel like I can't plan. That's a legit complaint. But criticism tends to start with the word you. You care nothing about our family. You care nothing about the well-being of our kids. You can, and now it's a personal attack. And there's a fine line, but when complaints turn to criticism, that's a dark road. And you can't fight for resolution when there's criticism. And not only criticism, Gottman and his team talk about contempt. Criticism is about the words that are being used. Contempt is about the tone. Contempt is about harshness. Contempt is about the nonverbals. Contempt is eye-rolling. It's sighing. And you know the thing with contempt, why it is so damaging to a relationship, is that contempt says to the other person, you're not even worth it. Contempt says, you're not even worth the energy. So you dismiss the person. I'll be honest with you. So, look, if you gave me 5 minutes to come to your home and I get to spend 5 minutes with you and your family and you and your spouse, and we sat down at a kitchen table and you allowed me to pull up a chair and just for 5 minutes just tell you anything I could possibly tell you about your home and just what it might look like to create a great home. I think if I had 5 minutes, one thing that I would tell you, I'd tell you a couple things, but one of the things I would tell you is this. Put a zero tolerance policy in your home on eye rolling and sighing. Zero tolerance. Because those actions are so dismissive and they are so filled with contempt. And you can't thrive in those environments. So he talks about criticism, he talks about contempt. And some of you, here's the thing, some of you, you see this, what James says here is this, be slow to speak. When you're in the middle of conflict, be slow to speak. Some of you are like, I'm good on this one. I'm good on this one. You know why? Because when there's conflict in my marriage, I don't say anything. I don't say anything. In fact, I leave the house. So I'm good with the slow to speak. But notice, by the way, that James doesn't say, don't speak. James says, be slow to speak. You need to speak. But just be slow to speak. You know, stonewalling is that place in a relationship where you don't give your spouse anything. You shut down. You don't talk. You pull away. You put up a wall. And stonewalling is destructive. It actually wrecks marriages. And the reason why is because when you stonewall, when you don't talk and you don't communicate and you put up that wall, you leave your spouse completely in the dark. They have no clue what you're feeling. They have no clue where you are. And because of that, they push harder to try to get a response. And because they push harder, what do? You withdraw further. And because you withdraw further, they push harder. And this endless destructive cycle that stonewalling brings about. How many stonewallers do I have out there? You wouldn't tell me anyways. You're stonewallers. You'd be like, I'm not telling you. I got a wall up right now, right? That's me. That's my MO. That's my thing. I'm a stonewaller. And I came by it honest. I guess if you're a stonewaller, you came by it honest. I mean, you know, we learned these things. I came by it honest because when I was younger, I had a lot of hurt and pain kind of come my way in life. And so I learned real quickly, I don't trust anyone else to take care of me. I take care of me. And I learned real quickly as well that I'm not going to give someone power over me. Like if I let them know that they can have an emotional influence, like if I get emotional over things that they do or say, that feels like I'm handing power over to them. I'm not giving them that gift. So I don't give you anything. So I learned it with the best. That is a horrible way to go into a marriage because I pushed Jenny away pretty quick. And there's been a couple of breakthrough moments by the grace of God over the last, 16 years of our marriage. I remember actually 5 years ago was one of them. 5 years ago it was a morning and we were getting ready and Jenny and I, gap, expectations and experience, and we got into it and there was conflict. And so I did what I always, I went back to my MO. I kind of reverted back to what I typically do. There's conflict. She's pushing. I pull away. And so I got in the car and I went to church to go to work. I'm going to serve God. Leave you at home. And I get about halfway to the church and I am compelled by this overwhelming sense. I need to go back home. I need to fight. We need to get into a fight. So I turn the car around and I go back home. And I walk in the door, and I'm not kidding, this is how the conversation went down. I walk in the door, and I walk straight up to Jenny, and I go, I'm really mad at you. And I just want you to know that. I am frustrated, I am angry, I am mad at you. And she says, thank you. Okay. And I said, I think I'm just real scared by some of the things that you said. And then we hugged, and I got in the car, and I went to work. But that second drive back, and I knew we were going to talk about it, a little bit deeper later, but the second drive back was so different. Not everything was taken care of, but man, there was resolution that was being, why? Because I let her in. Because she wasn't having to guess anymore. At least she knew where I stood. And we can do something with that. Because that can create intimacy. Guys, listen. There are some of you here today, and you need to fight. You need to talk because you've been keeping your spouse out. And it is time for some of you, you need to turn the car around and you need to drive back home and you need to talk and you need to get it out and you need to fight a little bit by letting them in. Some of you are stonewalling and you've kept your spouse out in the dark, and I want you to know it is not right. It's wrong. And you cannot thrive in your relationships if you keep doing that. It's time to talk. So James says, be quick to listen. Be slow to speak. And then there's a progression. He says, if you do that, you will be slow to get angry. And then he pushes it just one step further. In that very last sentence of that passage that we read, remember what we said? Human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. And that word right there, righteousness, it's kind of a weird, odd word. It's not a word we use a lot anymore, and yet it is so rich and beautiful. Righteousness essentially just means a right relationship with God, what it means to live in a right relationship with God. So when someone lives a righteous life, it means they're living in right relationship with God. Another way of saying it might be it's a life of living in step with God, in tune with God. And part of what James is saying is you can't just sit in your anger when there's conflict. You can't just say, I'm going to fight for victory, or you can't just sit in your anger and coerce. You can't just sit in your anger and say, fine, whatever, I'm just going to conform. You can't do that and live in tune with God and how God made you to be and who He created you to be and how He designed your marriage to be. You can't sit in anger and sit in coercion and sit in conformity and just say, I'm not going to do anything about it. He says, there's a better way. There's a better way. And listen, guys, that's what I want for you more than anything else. I want you to know that. I want that for you. I want that right there for you more than I want you to have a great marriage. I want you to live a life and to experience what it means to live a life in tune and in step with God and who He created you to be, and the relationships He created you to have, and the marriage He created you to have. And that's the beauty of conflict in marriage, is that conflict in marriage can lead us to discovering more of what it means to live in step with the God who created us. So the question today, and the only question you need to answer today, is simply this. The question is not, are you fighting? I already know you're fighting because you're in a relationship. So there will always be gaps between expectations and experience. I already know there's conflict. The question isn't, is there conflict? The question isn't, are you fighting? The only question you need to answer today is, are you fighting fair? Are you fighting fair? Are you fighting for resolution? Not just victory. And you'll know you're fighting for resolution when you're quick to listen. And you say, help me understand where you're coming from. I want to hear from you right now. And you listen to your own feelings, and you articulate those. And you'll know you're fighting fair when you're slow to speak. And when the words that you use, even in the middle of conflict, they're not critical. They're not filled with contempt. They're honoring and they're loving. And when you do that, and you fight for resolution in that way, you will experience a marriage and a relationship that can thrive even in the middle of conflict. And wouldn't that be great? Let me pray for us. God, we need your help on this one. We need your help because some of us have been navigating the conflict in our marriages and our relationships by trying to coerce the other person. And some of us have been navigating it by just conforming. And our marriages have lost life. And God, I don't believe that's what you want for us. I believe you have something better. I believe that you're calling us to go and to fight, like to just do it fair. But some of us, God, I think today some of us are here and we need to turn the car around and we need to go home and we need to fight some things out. Because conflict is the pathway to deepening intimacy. God, I just pray that we hold on to that truth and that reality. The conflict gives us the opportunity to understand our spouse a little bit better. So God, would you help us to be people who are quick to listen and slow to speak? Would you help us to be couples who would fight for resolution and not victory? And would you please give us thriving marriages as a result? We pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.